feel like I've really gotten out of my booktube groove because I keep filming these videos and then having to refilm them, and it's really annoying. I filmed this video the other day, and I filmed for like 2 hours, and I just decided I didn't want to have to go through 2 hours of footage, so I'm refilming it in hopes that I can really pare down my thoughts. Hi everybody, my name is Katie. This is the channel Life Between Words, if you're new here. As I was thinking about my favorite books of the year, I always try and think of ways that all of these books connect, and you know, I probably could come up with some more eloquent thoughts about this, but one thing I will say that I think is interesting, that my favorite book from the beginning of the year and my favorite book from the end of the year are very nice complements to one another and bookend the books in between very well. They both take place on the currents of a river, and they both have to do with storytelling. They both kind of feel a lot like you're taking a trip down the river and being pulled along by the current. I do kind of want my phone. Where is my phone? At the beginning of the year, I read the book Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield. This book was kindly sent to me by Atria, and I'm so appreciative. I really ended up loving this book, but I didn't think I was going to. Well, I mean, I thought I was going to before I started it, and then I read the book and finished it, and while I really, really enjoyed it, it's only with the passing of time that I realized how much of an impression this story made on me. One night at an inn situated along the River Thames, a grievously injured man and a young child burst into this inn that is known for storytelling. The man is injured, the child appears to be dead, but miraculously, after a short while, the child comes back to life. As the story goes along, you meet, I think, 3 or 4 different families that all seem to have a claim on this child. It feels like a dark fairy tale the way it's told, and in some respects you feel a little bit removed from the characters, which is why I wasn't sure I really liked it at the beginning of the year, because I love to feel attached to the characters. But the story was so beautifully told. It ebbs and flows like the current of a river. There's times when it moves slower and times when it really speeds up. And the whole time you want to know the history of this child. You are coming to know these families that all have a claim on the child. It's just such a masterfully told story. And I just ended up being really impressed by it. I have been working my way through Louise Penny's mystery series, her Armand Gamache mystery series, which is very well beloved. And I am one of those people that will sing its praises to the mountaintops. I love it so much. I love the character of Armand Gamache. I love the town of Three Pines. It takes place in a small English-speaking village in French-speaking Canada. This year, I only read one Louise Penny book. I'm working my way very slowly through the series because I love it so much and I want to take my time, but I could devour these, and part of me also wants to do that because I am taking so much time between books that I start to forget what's happening. Nevertheless, this year I read Bury Your Dead. You have to read this series in order because it builds on itself, and also every book gets better and better. In this book, Armand Gamache, our beloved inspector, is reeling from 2 things. One, an event that took place off-page that it was very tragic and that he is having trouble wrapping his head around. And then another that takes place in the last book, in which he is second-guessing the outcome of one of his investigations. He asks one of his investigators to go back to Three Pines to re-investigate, reopen this case, but kind of do it undercover. I feel like things are really heating up in this book, and I can't wait to keep going, even though I haven't yet. Every one of her books take place in a different season. This one was winter, so I might wait until spring to pick up the next one and then just start following the seasons, do one every quarter. But I loved this book. This series is one of my favorites. I love everything about it. What more can I say? This was the year of family sagas for me. I haven't read in my reading journey very many family sagas, and I read a couple this year that I really, really enjoyed. Both of them I really enjoyed, and I had a hard time choosing which one of these to put on this list, but ultimately I decided on Ask Again Yes by Mary Beth Keane. This one, however, follows the story of 2 different families. These families live next door to each other. They are connected both in space, like they are next door neighbors, but they're also connected because the husband/father in each of these families is a police officer. These families have a tumultuous history. You're exploring both their intricacies and dysfunction. You're also reeling from an event that takes place early in their history, And I'm not going to say anything more about that because it's part of the story, but it's very painful and it creates a huge rift between the families, while at the same time, two of their children fall in love. So you're also exploring the effect of that on these families. It is both heartbreaking, but it's also so redemptive. I love redemption stories, and I think that there's so much forgiveness and hope in this book, and that's why I love it. I love books that explore really painful things but are ultimately really hopeful and highlight forgiveness. So Ask Again Yes was definitely my favorite family drama, and I'm excited to read more in this sort of subgenre in fiction. I included 2 nonfiction titles in this list. The first that I'm going to talk about is the Read Aloud Family by Sarah Mackenzie. The reason I said the Read Aloud Revival is that Sarah Mackenzie also hosts a podcast called the Read Aloud Revival, which I sadly have not listened to very much of, but I would really like to, and I've known about it for years. I subscribe to it on my podcast app, but I just find myself gravitating towards other podcasts, and I don't know why, because Man Alive was this book excellent. I have extolled the virtues of the Read Aloud handbook many times, and Sarah Mackenzie wrote the Read Aloud Family kind of as a response, or almost like a companion to the Read Aloud handbook, even though, you know, she didn't write the Read Aloud handbook, but she was deeply affected by it. She has spent many of her years as a mother reading out loud to her family, so she wrote this book from her own experience, and I found it so encouraging and helpful, and it was so warmly written and engaging. I loved every moment of reading this book, partially because it does affirm my own values in terms of reading out loud to my kids, but it also gave some great strategies, because there are definitely times when I feel discouraged about my reading out loud. Like, sometimes I feel like my kids don't want to read out loud with me, or they're really distracted, or they're really rambunctious and they're not paying attention. And this book has a lot to say about those kinds of things that I found so helpful and also enlightening, and have kind of changed and readjusted my perspective and attitude about what reading aloud sometimes looks like, and just making it a part of your everyday life in a way that I think is really lovely. She also, at the back of the book, the last few chapters are read aloud suggestions, and they're wonderful. I recently got one of her picture books that she suggests, and oh my gosh, it's quickly become one of my family's very favorite picture books. We have read it every night for the last 2 weeks probably, and we love it. Maybe I'll talk about the next nonfiction book. None of these are in order, by the way. I loved all of these books. It's hard for me to rank them, so they are not ranked. So I'll talk about the other nonfiction book next, which I don't have because it was my mother's. I took it from her and have now given it back. And it took me most of the year to read. This book is The Warmth of Other Suns. It's by Isabel Wilkerson, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning nonfiction writer. This book didn't win the Pulitzer. I thought it did. I don't think it did, but it was still incredible, and it was one of those nonfiction books that I feel like every single person should read because it is so instructive. But not only is it instructive, it's also so engaging. This book is about the migration of African Americans from the South to the North throughout the 20th century, particularly kind of the early to mid 20th century. And the reasons behind it, how it's affected the South and the North, the ways in which that migration has shaped our country culturally, and the ways that we are still seeing effects from it. The way she decides to tell the story is through the eyes of 3 different people who migrate from different parts of the South to different parts of the North. One of them migrates to California, one of them migrates to Chicago, and one of them migrates to New York City. And they all do it at different times in the 20th century as well. You're getting this larger picture of what's happening, but you're also getting these really personal accounts, and I just thought it was brilliant. Everyone should read this book for so many reasons. I feel like at this time in our history, when we are seeing so profoundly that racism is truly not gone, that it still exists, and we're having lots of discussion about privilege and what that means, I think that this book gives a lot of context for what we're dealing with today. It is really big, so it's a commitment. I started this book in February, and I didn't finish it until November, I think, but every second that I spent with this book was wonderful, so the investment was worth it. Middle Grade March, which I host with my friend Krista from Books and Jams, has completely transformed my reading life. I have always enjoyed middle grade, but using March as an attempt to intentionally include middle grade novels and middle grade books in my reading, it has changed the course of my reading for the better, because I now have read so many incredible middle grade novels. I have 2 books that I read during middle grade March that I'm including on this list, and there were other middle grade books that I really, really wanted to include because I just love them so much, but sometimes you have to kill your darlings, and that is what I had to do. So there are other books that I would have loved to talk about today, but I'm just going to have to talk about another time. The first middle grade book that I want to mention is The War That Saved My Life. It's a World War II historical fiction novel that follows a young girl named Ada and her younger brother, and they live in London. And when the bombing raids happened at the beginning of World War II from Germany, many of the children were sent away from London to live in the countryside. Ada has a clubbed foot, and her mother has basically isolated her from the outside world. She is ashamed of her, she mistreats her, she's a terrible, terrible person. And Ada decides that, she's not going to send her away because she's ashamed of her. Ada decides she is going to go. So she teaches herself how to walk, and she escapes with her brother, gets on the train, and it goes to live with a woman named Susan. Susan has her own tragic past, and together this found family kind of learns how to open their hearts to each other. It's so beautiful. The writing is gorgeous. This is the kind of book that just makes your heart grow 3 times because it's so bittersweet. You know, Ada has had a lot of hardship, and she is very rough around the edges. She doesn't want to open up her heart. She's very distrustful. It's just the most beautiful story. This is a duology, and I'm currently reading the 2nd book in it, and I'm loving it just as much. I just think that Kimberly Brubaker Bradley is a beautiful writer, and this was an incredible World War II historical fiction novel that is about so much more than just the war. It's more that that's just the situation that they're in. If you hear that, it's just my leggings. I don't know if you can hear me squeaking, but I'm squeaking. Also for middle grade March is the book Sweep. You might see this on a few best of lists this year because this was our group pick for middle grade March. And it was also a breathtaking book that just kind of swept you off your feet. It's another historical fiction novel, but this one takes place in Victorian London and follows a young girl who is a chimney sweep. I didn't really know anything about the history of chimney sweeps. I did a lot of background reading as I was reading this book because that's what good historical fiction does. It makes you want to learn more about the time you're reading about and the situation that you're reading about. In this book we follow Nan Sparrow. I should actually clarify, the chimney sweep is usually the person overseeing the sweeps that go and actually do the sweeping. So they were usually adults who had a network of children that they used. Chimney sweeping was dangerous. A lot of children died because they got stuck up in the chimneys. It was a really brutal existence. Nan Sparrow was under the care of someone that she called the sweep, but he has now died. She finds herself working for a ruthless chimney sweep who cares not a nit for the children in his employ. And one day she gets stuck up in a chimney. The next thing she knows, she finds herself in an attic, and there with her is a little soot monster. So this is a little bit magical. There's a magical, fantastical element, even though it's grounded very much in historical reality. And she and the soot monster become friends. This soot monster is actually a golem, which is from Jewish folklore. And so you learn a little bit about that, and generally this golem has a very specific purpose. And so this golem is here to protect Nan. It's about friendship, it's about saving yourself by saving other people, it's about making the world a better place, even if that means heartbreaking sacrifice. And it's about kindness, and it's about what really makes a monster, because as the subtitle of this book says, Sweep, the story of a girl and her monster. But this monster that she befriends is really no monster at all. I also read Beartown this year, and I was blown away by this book. I remember finishing this book and just wanting to press it into the hands of everyone that I knew. I did press it into my mom's hands, and she did not have the same reaction as me, so I did come to find out that it is not everyone's cup of tea. But I loved it, and I felt like it was very timely, and it made me think so deeply, particularly about what justice really looks like and whether we can actually achieve justice, which I can't really talk in depth about because I feel like it would give too much away about the plot of the book. What I will say is that this book deals heavily with rape. So Do not read this unless you are in the headspace to deal with that heavy topic. In this book, we are following a town, a socioeconomically depressed town that feels that their only hope is this hockey team. And one day, the star hockey player rapes the daughter of the hockey team's manager. And it's kind of about the fallout of that, the lines that are drawn, the things that people choose to believe or choose not to believe, sort of the both the willful ignorance and also the support of this girl and her story, or in many cases the lack of support. The thing that Fredrik Backman does so masterfully in this book is that he tells the story with incredible nuance. The characters aren't just all good or all bad. There's a lot of gray, just like real people. Real people have both good and bad in them, and Fredrik Backman writes characters that feel incredibly true to life. They're capable of evil, they're capable of good, and they're also capable of kind of ambiguity. There were several scenes in this book that brought me to tears, but there was one scene in particular in which the mother of the hockey player goes to the house of the girl who was raped and falls on her feet on the front stoop as she's talking to this girl. And oh my gosh, it was so heartbreaking. And I've talked about this before, but as a mother, I put myself in the shoes of the mothers in stories, and I can't imagine the kind of emotions that this woman was dealing with. Both the love for her son, even though he did something truly horrendous to another human being. You love your children no matter what they do, but you also know that they have to deal with the consequences of it. And I just think that Fredrik Backman deals with these really complex situations in a way that is so moving. He writes so compassionately about these characters. Anyway, I really loved this book. I'm so glad that this was my first real introduction to Fredrik Backman. I have read A Man Called Uwe, but I listened to it on audiobook, and a lot of it just went in one ear and out the other because I have historically had a hard time with audiobooks. So I'm really glad that I gave Fredrik Backman another chance, and I will go back to Uwe. I will go back to Uwe because I know people love that one too, but Beartown was incredible. I did not read as many classics as I would have liked to this year, but I did read this behemoth, Gone with the Wind. This is a book that I think was published in the 1930s. I read this book with Robin, who runs the channel The Driftless Reader, and I loved my reading experience with her. I feel like this book, more than any other book, even more than Beartown, shockingly, gave me so much to think about. This book deserves a place on my top 10, and I absolutely loved it, but I do need to say that there's a huge asterisk with this book. It is appallingly blind in terms of how racist it is, and even for the time in which it was written, I think it was racist. I went on my own and did a lot of other research. I went down rabbit trails on the internet. I added a whole bunch of other books to my TBR about the Civil War because I just wanted to know more. But this book portrays a very particular vision of the antebellum South, what we call the lost cause myth, but what the people in this book would have considered the lost cause. There's a whole lot more to that I want to talk about, but I would have to do my own in-depth review of this book in order to really discuss what the lost cause is, and etc., etc. This is why I went down huge rabbit holes. Nevertheless, this book is very racist in terms of how it talks about African Americans, how it talks about the slave narrative. It's very, very hard to read those parts of this novel as a modern reader and not see how appalling it is. This is why I feel like this book deserves its own review, because I have a lot to say about that. Kind of like what I said in Beartown, we're all capable of such great evil and we're all capable of such great good. We have this dichotomy within ourselves. And so I thought a lot about that as I was reading Gone with the Wind, and I thought a lot about our blind spots, the blind spots from the past and our current blind spots today, because we have them. And I think it's important to remember that those were real attitudes that real people had. And so I think that there's still value in reading books like this. Anyway, that's why I still think there's value. That's why I loved this book. There was so much to digest and ruminate over and learn from and also enjoy. And I think that kind of encapsulates my reading experience of Gone with the Wind. Having said all that, Scarlett O'Hara and her love interest Rhett are two of the most vibrant, crackling characters that I think I've ever read. They jump off the page, both because they are so unlikable. Well, Scarlet is incredibly unlikable. She is selfish, she's vain. If we were to encounter anyone like her today, we would probably call her a sociopath because she really doesn't care about anyone. She only cares about herself. She uses people for her own gain, and she's also a terrible mother. And Rhett Butler sees a lot of himself in her, but I think the difference between Rhett and Scarlet is that Rhett knows he's a cad. He knows he's terrible and he's not going to change for anyone. He also is able to see the faults of everyone around him, and he can poke fun at their faults. Ultimately, at the center of this book swirls Scarlett O'Hara, who is a whirlwind. Although she has the spunk to pull herself out of the ashes of the war, she's bereft of friendship and love, and she realizes the true cost of all that she has sown because she is such a detestable human being. So this book is sweeping, it is epic, it is not without its appalling faults, and yet it is so readable, and the storytelling is so good. There wasn't a dull moment or a dull page in this book, and it's huge. I think it might be the biggest book I read this year. Last but not least, I have two William Kent Krueger books. I kind of felt like I had to include both, although that technically makes this a list of 11, not 10. So if I had to choose one, I would choose this Tender Land. So technically these are companion novels. You can read both of these books independently. They are not companion novels in that they share characters or even necessarily themes. What they share is place. So they both take place in New Brennan, Minnesota. And I could do a whole video on Midwestern fiction because I think I found a new love. Ordinary Grace takes place in the 1960s in New Brennan, Minnesota. And it follows this town as they deal with the untimely deaths of like 5 people from their town. It focuses in on one family, and it's sort of a coming-of-age story because Frank Drum, who is the main character, is recalling this summer in which his sister and these other people in his small Minnesota town died. It deals a lot with death, and I think that that's one of the reasons this book struck me so personally this year, because my year was kind of defined by death. My father-in-law died, my grandmother died, and it was a rough year. And this book focused on death in such a way that was so poignant and profound to me. There was a lot that I took away from that I just found so lovely, and also deeply, deeply sad. So this is not a happy book, although there are moments of happiness, and not just happiness, but sort of like the nostalgia for childhood summers in particular. It's lovely. I loved it. This Tender Land takes place, or at least it starts, in the 1930s in New Brennan, Minnesota. This book follows 4 orphans. All of these orphans are being cared for, although I say that term very loosely, at the Lincoln Indian Training School. One of the sad facets of our history are these boarding schools for Native American children. A lot of times these schools were incredibly abusive and just terrible, awful places, and that is the case with this school. 2 of the children that we follow are not Native American. One of them is, and I think the 4th is maybe part Native American. Odio Banyan is telling the story when he is an old man about these events that take place over the course of maybe a couple months in the summer of 1933, I think, 32. Odie commits a crime, and in response, he and his brother and these 2 other children run away from this school and travel down the Gilead River, and on their way, they meet a lot of different characters, a lot of different things happen to them. All of these children are in search of their deepest desires, and this is a journey of self-discovery in many respects. It's big, it's sweeping, it's another story about stories and storytelling. It has one of the most beautiful prologues I've ever read in my entire life. It also has one of the most beautiful endings I've ever read. I was swept away by the story. I loved it intensely. And as I was reading it, it was just one of those reading experiences where I knew I was reading something really special, and I knew I was reading a book that only comes along every so often. This was an amazing reading experience for me. I loved it. So there you have it, my friends. My top 10 books / 11 books. I am so pleased with my reading year. I feel like I had a hard time narrowing these down, and that is so telling of just a great reading year when you can't narrow down the books that you love. I mean, I did it, but it was really hard. I'm so thankful for my life as a reader. I'm so excited for what 2020 has to offer. I'm so excited to share with you my reading life again. I think that's everything. I'm gonna sign off now. I'll talk to you later. Bye.